My name is Noelle Carter. I was 19 the summer the roof leaked so badly that rain pooled in baking pans across the sales floor. I still remember the metallic thrum of drops hitting the tins while my father counted the register. Pretending not to hear, the shop smelled of damp cardboard and cinnamon gum, and every shelf listed like a tired sailor. Customers drifted in, glanced at the sagging walls, and drifted back out, their shoes making little apologies against the cracked linoleum. I had come home from college on break, full of plans that did not include inventory spreadsheets or bargaining with impatient vendors, yet something in my mother's voice that drew a thin, frayed twine of worry caught me. When she said, "Just until we get through quarter end," I saw the fear she tried to wipe off her cheeks before turning on the neon open sign, so I stayed. Those first weeks were a blur of mop water and endless tally marks. My palms blistered as I hauled merchandise from the sweltering storage garage, past the oil-spotted alley, into the shop that felt more like a wounded animal than a business. Dad kept muttering about good old days, but good days never balance ledgers, so I listened, nodded, and then did the one thing no one had attempted in years. I asked the people who still bothered to come inside what they actually wanted. Old Mrs. Rankin needed gluten-free flour. Coach Neville needed athletic tape in bulk instead of individual rolls. Teenagers wanted imported candy they'd seen on YouTube. I wrote every request in a marbled notebook and spent nights on the public library computer finding suppliers willing to ship small quantities to a nowhere zip code. Each confirmed order felt like snaring a firefly in a jar, fragile, glowing possibility. By August the pans were gone from the floor because I'd fixed the roof myself. Matching shingles under a sun so bright it bleached my eyelashes. On the day classes resumed, I opened my laptop to re-enroll, saw the tuition screen, and closed the lid. School could wait, I told myself, but the truth was simpler. I could not leave my parents to drown in their own dream. People assume duty feels like a chain, heavy and cold around the ankle. For me it felt like wind filling a sail. Every dawn I unlocked that splintered door, breathed in sawdust and sugar, and believed we could still matter in a world racing toward glossy superstore. I spoke with customers like neighbors, learned children's birthdays, delivered parcels in my own dented Honda when their schedules were tight. Little by little the till rang louder, longer. When I finally shut down the flickering sign each night, the hum inside the shop settled into something like hope. I did not notice the cost at first, how weekends evaporated, how friends stopped inviting me because I could never leave the register unattended. Christmas morning, I dusted shelves while cheery carols crackled from a radio missing its treble knob. But there was a fierceness in me, a conviction that if I worked hard enough, the ledger would reward the love I poured into it. My mother clung to that same faith, smiling when she saw the daily totals inch upward, squeezing my hand as though I were both anchor and sail. My father praised the numbers but rarely me. He liked to wear success like a tailored suit and ignored the seamstress. I brushed that aside. Family first, always family. Years blurred, I learned to read cash flow statements the way some people read weather. I could feel a coming shortfall like a stormache in my joints. We clawed from surviving to steady. Then, from steady to thriving, the storefront's splintered counter was replaced by smooth walnut. Handwritten labels gave way to barcodes. But every time someone complimented my parents on the turnaround, they chuckled and said, "We've still got a few tricks left, don't we?" I smiled beside them, invisible and indispensable. And each night, when I turned the deadbolt, I believed loyalty would guard me the way walls guard a heart. The expansion began with a single phone call. A shopkeeper 3 towns over was retiring and wanted his lease assumed before his last shipment. And he expired. I drove out at dawn, windows down, tasting road dust and possibility. By dusk I had signed the sublease, negotiated inventory at 35 cents on the dollar, and arranged for a moving truck. I didn't ask my parents' permission, I showed them projections instead, rows and columns in forest green ink that shimmered with profit. Dad grinned like a man who had taught me everything. Mom wept, relief and pride mingling on her cheeks. We hung a second sign by Thanksgiving. By the following summer, we broke ground on a third. Growth is never just arithmetic, it is emotion, risk, and sacrifice braided tight. Each new location demanded my presence, so I learned to exist in motion. 4-hour drives beginning before sunrise. Conference calls while refilling coffee at truck stop counters. Ledger reviews balanced on Steering wheels in motel parking lots smelling of pine disinfectant. I missed my cousin's wedding because the lights malfunctioned in store for an hour before Black Friday. I missed my own 28th birthday because an ice storm stranded me overnight with pallets of unscanned inventory. People sent cheerful, "Wish you were here" texts until they stopped, because I never was. Yet with every grand opening, with every ribbon snipped by oversized scissors, I felt the company breathe deeper. We hired veterans who needed steady work, single parents who needed flexible hours, high school kids saving for college. I fought for living wages in towns where minimum wage was the ceiling, not the floor. Margins thinned, but impact widened, and that trade nourished me more than bonuses ever could. Still, at quarterly dinners, Dad would polish his fork on a linen napkin and toast our vision, never mentioning the weeks I'd slept in shipping bays to protect inventory from January freezes. It was during the 5th location build-out that calamity struck. A supplier collapsed under debt, leaving us with half-paid invoices and empty trucks. Suddenly rent, payroll, and vendor tabs formed a noose around our solvency. Banks sniffed, saw regional headlines about retail gloom, and shrugged. My parents panicked, late one night, while frost ghosted my breath in the unheated storeroom. I opened a spreadsheet and realized we had 31 days before default. I drove to the city at dawn and sat across from a former classmate who had become a venture capitalist. He swirled ice in his glass, eyed me as though measuring fabric. I spoke plainly, no bravado. Just balance sheets and elbow grease. He admired the trajectory, lamented the lack of governance, and offered a lifeline: a silent capital infusion large enough to pay vendors, stabilize cash flow, and finance a small logistics hub in exchange. He wanted 10% equity and a seat held in trust for me. I negotiated him down to 8 and kept the seat for myself, drafting language that made me a minority stakeholder with voting rights in perpetuity. The night my parents signed the agreement, Dad was distracted, mind on overdue bills. Mom trusted any document I slipped beneath her pen. They never asked why my signature appeared in the shareholder section beside theirs. They just sighed with relief when vendor emails returned to polite, and trucks resumed rumbling up loading ramps. Crisis averted, and because we were exhausted and grateful, no one noticed the tectonic shift beneath our feet. The years that followed were the boom times. 7 stores became 9, 9 became 11. The brand script printed on reusable totes at statewide farmers markets. Local newspapers ran full-page spreads on the Carter family miracle. Photographs showed Dad shaking hands, Mom arranging flowers near the registers, and me balancing an iPad as though I were simply tallying minor miracles instead of orchestrating them. Friends who once pitied my sleepless hustle began asking for jobs. Investors cold called, but I declined. Growth, I said, must stay sustainable. Besides, my parents needed steady, not meteoric. Their health grew fragile in ways none of us wished to name. When Dad's blood pressure spiked, I flew him to specialist appointments and memorized the pill schedule so Mom could rest. I thought service forged unbreakable bonds. I thought love paid its own dividends. Meanwhile, that silent investor contract slept in a locked metal drawer of my home office, sandwiched between annual reports and faded sticky notes. Sometimes, on nights when exhaustion pinned me to the mattress and doubt dripped through unseen cracks, I slid the drawer open and traced the raised notary seal with my fingertip. It felt cool and reassuring, a quiet vow I'd made to protect all of us. I never imagined I would need its power against the people whose signatures sat beside mine. The crisis announced itself the way a summer storm crawls over flatland. First a strange hush in the air, then the sudden roar. One gray Tuesday, I sat alone in the back office clicking through month-end numbers that bled red no matter how many times I refreshed the screen. A key supplier had folded overnight, pulling half our winter inventory down with its own drowning debts, and the domino knock of unpaid invoices meant rent on 3 leases, 62 wages, and a mountain of tax withholding were all coming due. In the same choking week, I printed the balance sheet, spread it across the desk like a morgue sheet, and felt something ancient and instinctual inside me rear up: protect the family at any cost. First, I tried the polite doors. I scheduled meetings with 2 regional banks that had loved our growth story when the margins were fat. Their loan officers offered coffee, complimented my remarkable turnaround, and then slid glossy pamphlets across the table explaining why retail was suddenly outside risk parameters. One even suggested we consider controlled contraction. a euphemism for sacrificing stores people to appease spreadsheets. I thanked them, gathered my forecasts, and drove away on numb autopilot, my father's blood pressure pills rattling like dice in the glove box. By dusk I was parked behind the original storefront, forehead resting on the steering wheel while rain-stitched silver lines down the windshield. Mom's text lit up the dashboard. How did it go? I didn't answer. Instead, I allowed myself one wild, childish wish that I could press rewind to the days when fixing a leaking roof felt heroic. But the wish dissolved, and what remained was the stubborn knowledge that nobody was coming to save us. I was the grown-up in the room now, whether the room admitted it or not. That night, after my parents went to bed, I opened my laptop and scrolled through an alumni directory until I found Oliver Reyes. In college he had been the quiet kid who could solve differential equations while half asleep. A decade later he managed a venture capital fund that specialized in legacy to-scale retail pivots. I drafted an email that was equal parts confession and pitch deck, hit send at 11 a.m. and felt the adrenaline crash hard enough to make my hands shake. Oliver replied before sunrise, "Meet me in the city at noon." I left before my parents woke, the sky the ash blue of unspoken worry, halfway down the interstate. Doubt rode shotgun. What if inviting outside money was betrayal? What if losing control was worse than losing everything? Yet behind those fears was a fiercer truth. I would torch my own comfort to keep my staff and my parents from burning. So I kept driving, knuckles white on the wheel. Oliver's office sat on the 42nd floor, all glass and soft closed doors, a world calibrated to make supplicants feel small. He greeted me with a warm grin that didn't reach his analytical eyes. We talked numbers first: run rate, cost of goods, debt load, and then the intangibles, community goodwill, brand stickiness, the loyalty that can't be graphed but keeps registers ringing. I laid out a rescue plan I'd sketched on motel stationery. At 4 a.m., a centralized warehouse to slash freight costs, a digital storefront timed for the holiday surge, a lean training program to elevate assistant managers. When I finished, he drummed his fingers once, twice, and said, "You're asking for a lifeline, Noelle. What do I get in return?" His initial term sheet wanted 10% equity and veto power on major decisions. My pulse thudded in my ears, but I steadied my voice. "You get 8%, silent status, and an advisory vote held exclusively by me." Surprise flickered across his face. He hadn't expected the girl from his 8 a.m. calculus class to counter like a litigator. We haggled for an hour, slicing commas and contingencies until the deal felt less like surrender and more like strategic armor. Finally, he leaned back, signed, and said, almost admiringly, "You negotiate like someone who's been underestimated too long." We notarized the agreement in a sterile side room that smelled of toner and certainty. The notary slid the embossed seal across the paper, and the weight of that raised circle pressed into my chest like a second heartbeat. I was, by law, a minority stakeholder, now small on the cap table perhaps, but legally indivisible from the company's marrow. I tucked the originals into a fireproof folder, thanked Oliver, and rode the elevator down feeling both taller and perilously alone. The wire transfer hit our account before dinner. I gazed at the screen where 6 zeros replaced the dread that had camped there, and for a moment I allowed myself a shaky laugh. Then I drove home through twilight, rehearsing how to offer salvation without revealing how close we'd come to the cliff's edge. My parents were at the kitchen table, bills fanned like playing cards between them. When I placed the packet in front of Dad, his shoulders sagged with relief. He signed everywhere I flagged without reading the fine print, trusting me the way people trust oxygen. Mom brushed a kiss across my hairline, whispering thanks that tasted like absolution. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt the ache of a secret lodged behind my ribs. Because nestled inside that contract was language neither of them paused to question, clauses that named me shareholder, clauses that could one day weigh more than blood. Within 48 hours, vendors restarted shipments, employees exhaled, and the specter of payroll default retreated. Publicly, my parents credited smart financing and team perseverance. Privately, Dad raised a toast over takeout, declaring, "We're lucky you have a head for numbers, kiddo." I clinked my glass against his and swallowed the uneasy taste of destiny. Late that night, alone in my apartment, I slid the signed documents into the bottom drawer of a small steel safe. The metal trunk echoed in the quiet like a gavel. I rested, my palm on the cool lid, sensing new gravity in my bones. I had saved us, but the currency was power, and power, once claimed, changes its bearer. I told myself I would never need to wield it against the people I loved. I told myself loyalty still mattered. I almost believed it, for a while. The business and I moved in the same quiet rhythm, like two hearts beating inside one body. The crisis money did exactly what I had promised. It fortified supply lines, funded the regional warehouse, and padded payroll enough that no one dreaded envelope day. Within a year we were solvent again, then profitable, then lauded by a glossy state commerce magazine that photographed my parents beside pallets of fresh stock. I stood off to one side during the shoot, clipboard hugged to my ribs, making sure the forklift routes stayed clear. When the reporter asked who handled operations, Dad laughed and said, "Oh, our daughter keeps the lights on." The way someone might credit a faithful houseplant for fresh air. I smiled, because what else can a houseplant do except photosynthesize and hope not to be overwatered? Months blended into fiscal quarters. Each store had its own cadence, morning bursts in the college town, late-night surges near the interstate, rest stop, and I learned to tell time by the ebb of receipts. My phone never slept. It pinged during movies, stalled dates, echoed through shower steam. I answered every call, even when frustration rasped through the line. Because I believed leadership meant never letting anyone feel alone in a problem. When an assistant manager was diagnosed with lymphoma, I rewrote the schedule so her hours stayed intact while she sought treatment. The cost hit our margins. But the gratitude in her husband's handshake felt like profit of another kind. I never told my parents about the adjustment. I simply carried it, an invisible brick in the wall that kept us a bright dot at home. Life collapsed into small, manageable compartments, a toothbrush that never fully dried, frozen dinners balanced, atop tax binders, friendships distilled to cheerful emojis because nobody had the stamina for late-night phone calls after I missed one-to-many birthdays. Mom noticed the shadows under my eyes and pressed vitamin bottles into my hands. Dad, meanwhile, grew enamored with trade conventions, flying first class to shake hands with executives who treated him as visionary royalty. He mailed himself branded swag and lined his office with lanyards, proof that he belonged in rooms I had never been invited to enter. I felt a soft tug of envy, not for the applause, but for the ease with which he accepted it. Still, I measured my worth in solved problems, not speeches, and told myself I preferred the engine room to the captain's deck. The contract that made me an owner lay locked in that steel safe beneath a stack of quarterly reports. Sometimes, when insomnia rattled the windows, I knelt on the hardwood floor, spun the dial, and opened the door just wide enough to touch the embossed seal. The paper remained crisp, edges unframed. As though time respected the gravity of ink, I would close the safe again, feeling equal parts sheltered and ashamed. Sheltered because the document proved I was something more than the help. Ashamed because part of me feared the power it granted. I convinced myself I would never need it. Loyalty, I believed, was a stronger guarantor than any clause. In quieter moments I pictured alternate futures. The lives that branched off the day I chose family over university, perhaps a research job in a sunlit lab, perhaps travel stamped across a dog-eared passport. The visions flickered like distant lanterns and then winked out when the warehouse alarm chimed or Mom texted about a glitch in the POS system. I told myself I was exactly where I was meant to be. Purpose is a melody easy to hum when the chorus is praise. Yet hairline crack spider through that story. A regional manager once introduced me as the girl who handles scheduling to a new supplier, and the word girl lodged in my throat like ground glass. I joked it off, but the laugh tasted metallic. At the annual banquet, a consultant toasted the Carter patriarch for steering the company through stormy seas. My father bowed as though he alone had manned the oars. Later that night, while clearing empty glasses from the tables so servers could clock out sooner, I heard two junior buyers debating whether I was just staff or maybe someday in HR. Their ignorance wasn't malicious, it was casual. The way people misname constellations because the sky feels too large to learn precisely. Still, I drove home with the radio off, letting silence tally every unseen hour I had given. Mom remained the bridge between Dad's pride and my exhaustion. She'd slip into my office with peppermint tea, squeeze my shoulder, and murmur, "Don't let the world make you hard." I wanted to ask whether family counted as world or heart, but the words curled back like shy petals. Instead, I printed fresh sales reports for Dad, highlighting growth he could brandish at the next convention. Each time he read them, he'd nod, satisfied, never noticing the thin black line in the footer where my minority stake appeared in 6-point font. I had written that line myself. Its invisibility was a kind of magic trick, and like all magicians, I thrived on the audience never seeing the wires. When health scares nudged my parents towards semi-retirement discussions, I drafted a succession plan that installed professional management while leaving them ceremonial titles. Dad skimmed it, frowned at the suggestion he relinquished day-to-day decisions, and tossed the binder onto his credenza. Plenty of time for that, he scoffed. The same way he dismissed blood pressure spikes as flukes, I gathered the ignored pages, slid them back into my briefcase, and told myself patience was another facet of loyalty. In truth, a fragile resentment began to pulse beneath my sternum, faint but insistent, like a buried metronome ticking toward some unknown tempo. 17 years can pass without fanfare. They accrete like rings in a tree trunk, silent testimony to seasons survived. On the surface, our family looked unbreakable. Holiday newsletters boasted 11 thriving locations and included photos of Dad cutting ribbons, Mom arranging charity baskets, me half-cropped beside a display holding a tablet. I framed those clippings in the break rooms to remind staff how far we'd come, but at night the images felt staged, as though the photographer had obscured the scaffolding that kept the whole structure standing. I was that scaffolding, unseen and load-bearing, and some nights I wondered whether the weight would finally splinter me. Still, dawn always arrived with a to-do list longer than regret. And action is the surest balm against disquiet. I signed invoices, optimized routes, argued shipping discounts, mediated disputes about shelf real estate, employees confided divorces and miscarriages. Suppliers extended credit lines because they trusted my handshake more than the corporate letterhead. Loyalty, I thought, was a two-way street if you paved it every day. I never imagined there could be a sinkhole waiting at the far end, disguised beneath familiar asphalt. So I kept marching, heart first, believing the universe took note of diligence and repaid it with protection. In hindsight, that faith was both armor and blindfold, because while I bent over spreadsheets and cared for everyone else's emergencies, my parents were learning a dangerous new vocabulary in the echo chambers of industry conferences. Words like modernize, management, inject fresh vision, shake up leadership. I heard echoes of those phrases on speakerphone calls I wasn't invited to join, but I chalked them up to posturing, the harmless strut of executives comparing plumage. What I didn't see, what love refused to let me suspect, was that the target of their future shake-up was already in the building, wearing my name badge, trusting that loyalty was enough. Monday dawned with that false clarity only late autumn can manage, the sky a washed-out blue above trees already stripped bare. I arrived at headquarters early, as always, balancing a cardboard tray of lattes, almond milk for Mom, half-cough for Dad, black for me, and humming the opening bars of a song I couldn't quite place. The lobby smelled of floor wax and cinnamon, muffins cooling beside the receptionist's desk. Overhead, fluorescent lights flickered awake in reluctant succession. Everything looked ordinary, almost tender in its familiarity. Yet a ripple of unease traveled my spine the moment I swiped my badge. The green light flashed, the lock clicked open, and still my pulse stuttered, as though the building were inhaling just a little too deeply. In the hallway outside the executive suite, two regional managers stood shoulder to shoulder, whispering, with such intensity that they didn't notice me until the soles of my shoes squeaked on the polished tile. They startled apart with guilty smiles, like kids caught pocketing bubble gum. I offered them the extra latte meant for whoever forgot breakfast, but they each raised a hand already fueled. Thanks before excusing themselves toward opposite stairwells. I stared after them, latte warming my palm, and wondered what new rumor had them skittish. The company rumor mill was usually harmless, all engagements and impending transfers. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling I'd opened a novel already missing its first page. Dad's assistant, Marlene, waited by the glass conference room doors, clutching a manila folder so tightly her knuckles blanched. She was the model of administrative discretion, hair in the same neat bun every day, lipstick never straying beyond its precise borders. Yet that morning a single strand had escaped and curled against her temple, the only sign of turbulence beneath her composure. "Your parents would like to see you," she said, voice pitched low enough that the havoc almost swallowed the words. She pressed the folder into my free hand, turned on her sensible heels, and retreated down the corridor without meeting my eyes. Inside, the lights were dimmed, blinds drawn against the morning glare. Dad sat at the head of the oak table, elbows planted wide, fingers laced as if bracing for an earthquake. Mom occupied the chair to his right, posture impeccable, hands folded in her lap. Between them lay a single sheet of letterhead, a white island under the pendant lamp's cone of light. My first absurd thought was that we were planning a surprise party. Perhaps Marlene had printed invitations. As I stepped closer, scent of espresso trailing me like proof of good intentions. Mom's gaze skittered to the floor. Dad cleared his throat. The sound echoed off the glass walls, cavernous and wrong. He began with a phrase so sterile it barely registered as language. We've been giving this significant thought. I set the coffee tray on the credenza, adrenaline rushing my ears, and forced a smile meant to bridge whatever awkwardness hovered. He did not smile back. Instead, he slid the document toward me. I recognized the margin standard HR template we used for terminations. Employee name, effective date, property to be returned. Only this time in crisp 12-point font. The name was mine. The paragraph explaining cause had been left blank. Legal had advised it was cleaner. No severance, no accrued vacation payout, no mention of the silent equity I held. Just a sentences about strategic vision and leadership realignment, followed by the instruction to vacate the premises by noon. As though 17 years of breath and bone could be boxed before lunch, I heard my mother sniff, not a sob, but the sharp inhale of someone who has rehearsed not crying. Dad avoided my stare and, instead, focused on the pen he nudged beside the paper in case signatures were required. For a moment the room vibrated with memory, late night sorting, receipts, flu seasons powered through on cold coffee, the year we ate canned beans so payroll wouldn't bounce. None of that made it onto the stationery. Loyalty, apparently, was as disposable as the single-use cup sweating on the credenza. Silence lengthened until even the ventilation system seemed to hush. I realized they were waiting for me to erupt, to unleash the fury their own guilt had rehearsed defenses against. I surprised all three of us by reaching instead into the pocket of my blazer. Retrieving a small leather notebook where I tracked daily tasks, I flipped to a blank page, clicked my pen, and asked quietly, evenly, who would assume oversight of the open purchase orders, the pending lease renewal, the warehouse audit scheduled for Friday. My voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone narrating a scene from far above. Dad blinked, caught off guard. We'll redistribute, he said, but the assurance wobbled on his tongue. Mom whispered my name, half apology, half plea for understanding. I nodded, once acknowledgement or farewell. I couldn't tell, and clicked my pen closed. No F-bombs cratered the carpet, no chair legs screeched across wood. I simply folded the termination letter into the notebook, picked up the untouched lattes and handed one to each of my parents. Habit, it seemed, outlived employment. Outside the conference room, the hallway stretched impossibly long. Doors on either side reflecting my figure like mirrors in a funhouse, versions of me at various ages, lugging boxes, coaching trainees, patching drywall. I walked past them all, toward the exit, my badge still warm from the morning swipe. At my office I gathered only what mattered, a framed photo of the flagship store on opening night, the jade plant I had nursed from a 2-leaf cutting, and the fireproof folder I kept locked in the bottom desk drawer. The folder felt heavier than paper should allow. Its weight steadied my hands while I slipped the photo inside my satchel and carried the plant like an offering. I did not make a farewell lap, did not pause beside the breakroom bulletin board where staff anniversaries were tacked with celebratory stars. Mine had recently turned 17, unremarked. Instead, I strode to the lobby, nodding at Marlene, who looked simultaneously relieved and heartsick. My reflection in the glass door startled me, hair neat, blouse unwrinkled, eyes clear. I had always imagined betrayal would leave visible wounds, but it turns out pain can masquerade as impeccable poise. The parking lot was bright, sun high now, asphalt already breathing waves of heat. I set the jade plant on the passenger seat, fastened the folder in the briefcase on the floorboard, and sat for a while with the engine off. Around me employees arrived in little bursts of ceremony, engines idling, backpacks slung, chatter floating on the thin November air. None of them noticed their former boss watching through the windshield. I considered honking, waving, explaining, then I remembered the blank space where HR should have listed cause. Explanation, it seemed, was overrated. Instead, I pulled out my phone and called the attorney whose number I kept under in case of rain. It rang once before he answered, tone brisk. As though he'd been expecting the storm. "It's time," I said. Voice steady as the folders and wavering heft. He replied that he would start drafting notices to the board, and I thanked him as courteously as if we were confirming a lunch reservation. When I finally started the engine, I felt an unfamiliar calm settle around my shoulders, quiet, deliberate, almost clinical. Hurt, yes, but also a dawning comprehension that the story of my life had just changed tenses. They had written me out with a single sheet of paper, but somewhere in a safe 3 miles away was another sheet they had signed long ago, a document no one could rescind with a brisk Monday memo. As I eased out of the lot, tires crunching over fallen leaves, I realized loyalty could still protect me, just not in the way I had once believed. I drove straight past my apartment and kept going until the suburbs thinned into farmland, because I needed sky rather than ceilings while my mind rearranged the furniture of the last 17 years. Wind rattled the windows, whipping through rows of harvested corn stubble, and the flat horizon felt honest in a way fluorescent offices never had. Nothing here hid behind polished glass. I pulled onto a gravel turnout beside an abandoned grain elevator, killed the engine, and listened to the ticking cool of metal while my heartbeat wrestled with the echo of Dad's voice saying leadership realignment. The phrase tasted like tin. I opened the briefcase, lifted the fireproof folder onto my lap, and traced the grooves of the lock as though consulting a compass. I had guarded these papers out of duty. Now I realized they were also a lifeboat large enough to carry me and the company's soul out of the wreck my parents had set in motion. When I pried the latch, the scent of old ink drifted up, sharp as cloves. I unfolded the silent investor agreement, the notary seal still crisp beneath translucent tissue, my younger signature curved across the page with uncharacteristic flourish. I remembered the relief that had flooded me the night we signed, the silly pride of a daughter safeguarding her parents' dream, the fine print I had drafted in the campus libraries after hours quiet spelled out voting rights, fiduciary obligations, and most crucially, a clause requiring unanimous board approval for any action that could materially prejudice a minority stakeholder, terminating me without cause, with no severance. While I held that stake was more than unkind, it was a breach. The realization didn't spark vengeance. It simply settled inside me like a level finding true north. I had been hurt, yes, but I was also armed with legality my parents had never bothered to read. I placed the contract on the passenger seat and dialed my attorney again. The signal wavered out here, so each ring crackled like distant thunder. When he answered, I imagined him at his mahogany desk beneath framed diplomas, steady and unflinching where I still shook. I read the board approval clause aloud, the words suddenly vibrant, alive. He exhaled a thoughtful hum. Breach of fiduciary duty, he confirmed, is not a small sin under corporate law. With documentation, a minority owner could call for removal of executives who acted against the interests of the company or against her own protected stake. We follow procedure, he said, quiet. Clean, uncontestable, we agreed on. A timeline, notices to directors within 48 hours, emergency meeting set for the earliest date the bylaws allowed, motions drafted with surgical precision. Courtroom drama wasn't our aim. Quiet rectification was. I thanked him, but gratitude felt too thin, as though I were thanking a scalpel for being sharp. Phone cradled between shoulder and ear. I skimmed the rest of the corporate records I had hoarded, vendor contracts, lease guarantees, personal emails in which Mom praised my miracle refinancing. Each sheet resurrected a memory. Nights I slept in the warehouse listening for the alarm during holiday rush. Mornings I drove Dad to cardiology checkups before opening store doors at dawn. I realized my parents hadn't just forgotten the fine print, they had forgotten the texture of my sacrifice, the hum of my loyalty underpinning every surge in their net worth. That amnesia stung more than the termination itself. Still, outrage burned off quickly, leaving a steadier ember. Resolve. My goal was not revenge, it was stewardship. The company served hundreds of employees and communities who depended on its presence. Their paychecks, their kids' braces, their rent did not deserve to wobble because my parents wanted to play at reinvention. A truck roared past, scattering grit against my windshield, and the jolt snapped me into motion. I returned the documents to the folder, turned the key in the ignition, and headed back toward town. On the drive I rehearsed what came next. gather digital backups to a secure cloud vault. List key allies on the board, craft a concise narrative, framing the breach as a lapse in judgment rather than malice. The calmer I sounded, the less oxygen gossip would have. My attorney had advised no direct contact with my parents until the meeting notice landed. The bylaws guaranteed I didn't need their blessing. The thought should have felt triumphant. Instead, it ached, like pressing on a bruise to confirm the pain. Night had fallen by the time I reached my apartment. Streetlights pulled orange on slick pavement, and my reflection in the lobby glass startled me, hair tousled by wind, cheeks flushed where tears had dried without my noticing. Up in my unit I flipped on every lamp, craving brightness. I brewed tea I wouldn't drink, then spread the documents across the kitchen island, each page anchored by a mug or stapler against unseen drafts. The apartment smelled of paper, ink, and bergamot, a scent to blow of war rooms and waiting rooms alike. I opened my laptop and began compiling a timeline, contracts executed, capital infused, milestones achieved under my oversight. Facts were my armor. Emotion could wait. Around midnight the silent apartment grew louder with remembered voices, dad laughing at trade show swag, mom cautioning don't let the world make you hard. I leaned against the counter, eyes stinging, and allowed grief its minute in the spotlight. 17 years of swallowed frustration and unacknowledged triumphs rose like flood water. I didn't sob. The tears came slow, measured, as if even my pain preferred structure. When they stopped, the room felt lighter, the path clearer. Loyalty, I realized, had not been wasted. It had simply matured into something sturdier. Responsibility to the enterprise itself. To every cashier practicing back-to-school smiles, to every driver navigating black ice highways at dawn, my parents had mistaken the company for a private inheritance. I now understood it was a community trust, and I was its reluctant but resolute guardian. I slept little, but when dawn crept through the blinds in a seam of pewter light, I felt steadier. I drafted the official board meeting notice, citing the clause my parents had skipped, attaching the termination letter as Exhibit A. The language was clinical, but beneath each syllable pulsed a daughter's heartbeat. I pressed send, heard the whoosh of email leaving, and sat back in the hush that followed. Outside, the city began its Monday rituals. Garbage trucks clanged. A neighbor's dog yipped at unseen threats. Inside, I sipped the now cold tea and watched the sky shift from pewter to pale gold. My parents would wake soon, open their inboxes, and find the first sign that the daughter they had dismissed was, in fact, an owner. I pictured mom's face, crestfallen, dad's jaw setting in defensive disbelief. The thought hurt, but I didn't flinch. Sometimes love must stand up straight, even if it towers over the people who taught it to kneel. I gathered the papers into neat stacks, slid them back into the folder, and locked the clasp. There was still work ahead: phone calls, board votes, security protocols, but for the first time since that sterile conference room, my pulse beat evenly. In the quiet hush of dawn, I understood something simple and seismic. I was no longer asking for a seat at the table. I was building the table, and I already held the deed. Although the board meeting notice had already taken flight through cyberspace, my real work began in the hours that followed. When adrenaline bled away and left behind a shaky calm, first came the checklists, due columns on a yellow legal pad titled What We Control and What We Anticipate. Under the first I wrote short, solid verbs: secure documents, confirm allies, update credentials. Under the second I listed the softer, messier nouns: anger, denial, press inquiries, silence. I kept the pad open on the kitchen table, its pages curling in the steam of my reheated coffee, so every stray worry could be pinned before it skittered off like a moth in lamplight. I started with the tangible, a portable scanner hissed to life, relaying every contract, email thread, and vendor memo into a cloud vault protected by two-factor authentication. The steady glow of the progress bar felt like a heartbeat I could borrow when my own rhythm faltered. Each completed upload earned a neat checkmark on the pad, and the page began to look less like chaos and more like choreography. Next, I built a dossier for each board member, a concise packet outlining performance metrics under my tenure, the legal language of fiduciary duty, and the specific clause my parents had breached. I used polite fonts, softened the edges with bullet points, but left the core unfiltered. Our founders failed to fulfill their obligations to a minority shareholder, thereby jeopardizing the company's legal standing. The words were clinical, but in my head, I heard the whispered undercurrent. They jeopardized their daughter. Not a single packet mentioned blood or betrayal. Numbers do the cleanest talking. By dusk the living room looked like an evidence locker, papers stacked in tidy, labeled piles beside a row of courier envelopes bearing overnight stickers. I paused then, hands braced on the back of the couch, staring at the silhouettes of those envelopes. Somewhere inside another version of myself still wanted to crumple them all, call my parents, and beg for the comfort of a shared meal, a conversation that would rewind the last 24 hours. But every time that impulse flickered, I saw the termination letter's blank cause line, and the flicker died. My phone chimed with a new email. The attorney had finalized draft resolutions for executive removal. I read each paragraph slowly, measuring its weight. The language never used words like mother or father. It spoke, instead of incumbent officers and material impairment, in corporate law. Emotions are converted to liabilities, grief to proceedings. I signed electronically, watched the animated checkmark bloom, and tried not to imagine the look on my parents' faces when their inboxes mirrored mine. Another chime, this time a text from Jenna, the warehouse supervisor who'd started as a stock clerk under my training program. Everything okay? Heard chatter. Chatter meant leaks, and leaks meant time was shorter than bylaws promised. I thumbed back, all good, big changes coming, trust me. Then I stared at the blinking cursor, wanting to add hearts, smiley faces, something soft, but clarity was kinder than reassurance I couldn't guarantee. So I hit send and let the gray bubble drift away alone. Sleep, that night, arrived in broken increments. I drifted off only to jolt awake, convinced I'd forgotten some pivotal document. At 3 a.m., I found myself photographing the jade plant's care instructions taped to its pot. Absurdly afraid the symbolism of its survival, so green, so stubborn, might be lost if it withered during the coming storm. I set gentle calendar reminders for watering, then laughed at myself, a brittle sound in the dark. Priorities, I whispered, and pulled the blanket higher. Morning smeared pale lilac across the blinds, and with it came the first email response. Board member Ellis acknowledged receipt of the emergency meeting notice. In accordance with Article 7, Section 4, I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. One by one, replies trickled in, some terse, some sympathetic, none hostile. No one mentioned my parents' names, they addressed only the legal issue. As though distancing themselves from the human tangle beneath, that professional remove both stung and reassured me. Feelings would not derail procedure. I showered, dressed in the navy suit I reserved for bank negotiations, and tied my hair back tight enough to still the restless strands. The mirror reflected a woman who looked older than yesterday, eyes ringed in charcoal fatigue, but lit with something harder to name. I thought of Mom's warning not to let the world make me hard and felt a quick, twisting ache, but hardness, I realized, was just another word for density. For carrying more of myself in less space. I would be hard where the company needed armor and soft where my people needed shelter. The trick was learning the switch. Before heading to the attorney's office, I drove to the flagship store. I parked in the alley, slipping through the employee entrance so staff wouldn't mob me with questions I legally couldn't yet answer. The scent of fresh-baked cinnamon rolls from the in-store cafe drifted down the corridor, mingling with detergent and cardboard, a perfume equal parts commerce and comfort. I walked the aisles, fingertips brushing product labels, each item a tiny promise to a customer I might never meet. Near the seasonal end cap, a young trainee was wrestling with a box cutter. Blade stuck. I took it from her, clicked the release, freed the blade, and handed it back. She grinned, murmuring a thanks so reflexive she didn't recognize me in corporate armor. Somehow that anonymity felt like the purest praise. In the stockroom I paused before the old-time clock mounted on the brick wall. Its surface was nicked from years of punch cards, and for a heartbeat I saw 19-year-old Noelle dusting shelves beneath a leaky roof, utterly certain loyalty was its own reward. I pressed my palm flat against the cold metal and whispered, hang in. Whether I was speaking to the clock, the company, or my younger self, I wasn't sure. Back in the car I reviewed my checklist one last time. Only two boxes remained unchecked: security transition and public statement. Security would wait for the board vote, statements would come after. For now, the silence was purposeful. Like the hush before an orchestra lifts its instruments, I closed the notebook, slid it into my briefcase beside the jade plant's watering schedule, and started the engine. Gravel crunched beneath the tires as I pulled away, each rotation carrying me closer to a meeting that would redefine family and business in a single stroke of collective pen. Traffic lights blinked from red to green as if blessing my passage. I merged onto the highway, windows cracked for cold air, the roar of wind loud enough to drown the ghost of my father's baritone, my mother's gentle sighs. Ahead, the city skyline rose in disciplined angles, steel and glass catching the early sun. Somewhere inside those towers my parents sat in corner offices. Perhaps reading the same electronic summons that now glowed on my dashboard. I did not wish them pain, I wished them understanding, swift and merciful, but whether they embraced comprehension or fought it, the die was cast. Responsibility, once claimed, doesn't retreat. I tightened my grip on the wheel, the fine print contract safely stowed beneath the armrest, and felt a quiet certainty settle over me, an acceptance that the next time I walked those corporate halls, my badge might skin green again. Not because I sought permission but because I held authority. The thought didn't fill me with triumph. It filled me with a solemn, almost sacred sense of stewardship. The exit for downtown loomed ahead, blue sign bright against morning haze. I flicked on my blinker, joined the turning lane, and whispered a final promise into the wind-whipped cabin. Whatever comes, I will hold this company steady. Then I took the curve, engine humming steady beneath my feet, and let the city swallow me whole. The conference room reserved for extraordinary matters occupied the 15th floor, its walls of frosted glass revealing only vague silhouettes, like fish drifting behind aquarium fog. I arrived early, attorney in tow, carrying a leather folio that contained every piece of paper capable of slicing through sentiment. While he arranged tablets and exhibits at the polished walnut table, I stood at the window and watched the city compress traffic into glittering filaments far below. The view felt godlike and nauseating at once, as if altitude alone could blur the details of what we were about to do. Board members filtered in by twos and threes, the hush of their greetings betraying a collective uncertainty. Some offered tentative smiles, others avoided my eyes, perhaps hoping neutrality might spare them the weight of choosing sides. I answered each nod with calm civility, the same composure I'd trained into myself during years of customer complaints and supplier brinkmanship. On the inside my pulse fluttered like a trapped moth, but outward ease was a rope bridge these directors needed to cross. If I wobbled, they might tumble into the chasm between family drama and fiduciary duty. At precisely 10:30, the elevator chimed again. My parents stepped out, flanked by their counsel, the wide glass doors sighing shut behind them. Dad's tie was cinched tight enough to redden the skin beneath his collar. Mom's hands were clasped around a notebook so firmly the pen left a crescent in her knuckle. They paused when they saw me at the head of the table, my accustomed place. When presenting quarterly results, then continued forward, faces settling into practiced cordiality. We exchanged the polite hellos of strangers who recognize one another's last name but have forgotten the context of intimacy. When the last director had signed the attendance sheet, we called the meeting to order. My attorney handled the procedural preamble, his baritone impersonal, each clause cited with the precision of rainfall on a tin roof. He placed the termination letter on the table and, beside it, the silent investor agreement whose notarized stamp caught the overhead light like a coin. Explaining the breach took 5 minutes. The silence afterward took longer, stretching thin as taffy while comprehension seeped into every corner of the room. I did not speak until invited, because the words mattered more if they came after the law's scaffolding had been erected. When the chair recognized me, I rose not quickly, not theatrically, and folded my hands on the table. I told them the simplest truth, that stewardship of the company had never belonged to one generation alone, that the livelihoods of hundreds required leadership unmarred by personal agendas, and that I had offered loyalty for 17 years expecting only integrity in return. I kept my voice low, the rhythm unhurried, each sentence laid like a stepping stone toward an inevitable shore. They did not need theatrics, they needed a compass. Dad's lawyer objected that termination fell within executive prerogative, but the clauses we drafted a decade earlier had anticipated exactly this maneuver. My attorney answered briskly, citing subsections, the words self-dealing and material prejudice floating in the air like acrid smoke. Across the table Dad's jaw tensed. A flash of something fear, perhaps, passed behind his eyes. Mom tilted forward as if to speak, then thought better, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her sleeve instead. Watching her restraint felt like seeing a bird hold its wings flat to avoid a glass wallet alone. Perceived. The vote to remove both founders from active executive roles required a simple majority. One by one, board members pressed the green button on their digital screens, the tally lighting up in quiet, irrevocable increments. No one applauded when the requisite number was reached. Even victory wore a shroud of mourning. I felt rather than heard my heart beat slow, as though my body recognized a burden transferred at last from muscle to document. Formalities persisted, motions to appoint interim officers, resolutions to secure company assets, instructions to update banking signatories. Each passed with the same muted efficiency. My parents remained seated, their lawyer whispering occasionally, but the tide had turned, and they seemed to sense that swimming against it would only exhaust what dignity they had left. When the last agenda item concluded, the chair invited any final remarks. Dad's eyes met mine across the expanse of walnut and legal pads. For a moment the room's hum faded, and I saw not an executive but the man who once carved my initials into a kite string holder so the wind would never steal my joy. The memory burned like sunlit snow. He cleared his throat, but whatever words gathered there were caught by gravity. He shook his head once, stood, and guided Mom toward the exit. They left without looking back. The doors hushed behind them sounded heavier than any slam. I remained seated until the directors dispersed. One or two offered soft congratulations. For what it's worth, they murmured, as if unsure the phrase had currency in such an emotional economy. I thanked them, gathered my folio, and allowed myself a single minute of stillness. The leather edges beneath my fingertips felt oddly warm, as though the documents inside had absorbed the heat of revelation. Security protocols activated quickly. IT revoked founding-level credentials. Facilities changed master codes. I signed new authorizations, initials looping less neatly as fatigue set in. The motions felt surgical, more necessary than triumphant. Power, I understood now, is never seized in the lightning crack of spectacle. It is assumed in the hum of card readers reprogrammed. In the whisper of login screens accepting a new name. Late afternoon sun slanted through the once fogged walls, now clear, revealing a skyline acrylic sharp in autumn air. My attorney asked whether I wanted an escort to the executive suite. I declined. I knew every hallway, every carpet stain, every humming vent above the copy room. They were the geography of my adult life. I walked them alone, badge clicking against my belt loop like a metronome resetting a song. The suite greeted me with quiet AC and the faint afterscent of my parents' cologne. Their belongings would be boxed tomorrow by HR, a formality both clinical and merciful. I would not supervise that disassembly. Instead, I sat at the corner desk where Dad had once displayed framed newspaper clippings of our miracle turnaround. The frames were still there. I turned one face down, then another, until the photographs lay silent as closed eyes. Perhaps one day I would stand them upright again, once memory no longer stung like raw skin. Evening bled violet beyond the windows. I pulled a legal pad from the drawer and began listing names: regional managers, department heads, cafe bakers, truck drivers, people who needed reassurance before rumor outpaced truth. The first call would be to Jenna at the warehouse. As I wrote her number, tears finally breached the dam, sliding hot and unchecked. They did not derail my pen, they simply salted the paper where responsibility met grief. I let them fall. Because in that room I was both the architect of a coup and a daughter whose parents had chosen distance over dialogue. The duality did not need immediate reconciliation, it only needed acknowledgement. When the list was complete, I reached into my bag and withdrew the jade plant. I set it on the windowsill where west-facing light would find it in the mornings. Its thick leaves gleamed, stubbornly alive. I pressed a fingertip into the soil just moist enough. Outside, office towers flicked on their grids of artificial stars, and somewhere below, traffic began its nightly exhale. I inhaled deeply, feeling the ache of a responsibility fully claimed, and whispered to the plant as much to myself as to it, "We're still standing." Then I turned off the overhead lights, locked the door behind me, and stepped into the corridor where the company's future waited, quiet and immense, for steady hands to guide it through the night. The morning after the coup, I arrived at headquarters before sunrise. The city still rubbed raw with sleep. Street lamps cast long, trembling shadows that seemed to hesitate at my feet, as if the night itself were unsure whether it should follow me inside. I paused on the marble steps. clutching my travel mug, breathing in air that smelled of wet pavement and late autumn leaves. For the first time in 17 years, I possessed keys not assigned by someone else's authority but created by my own. Their weight felt almost theatrical in my palm, slim bits of metal that could summon light or lock out ghosts, depending on how I turned my wrist. Inside, corridor bulbs flickered awake in a soft wave, illuminating silence where after-hours cleaners had already swept the floors and straightened the mats. My heels clicked a slow metronome toward the office suite that once bore my parents' names. Yesterday, the facilities team had removed the brass plaques, polishing away fingerprints until only for tiny screw holes remained pinprick constellations hinting at a vanished era. I stopped to touch the empty rectangle of wall. The paint was slightly darker beneath, spared from years of sunlight. Memories can leave their own shadows, invisible to strangers, undeniable to those who stood in the glare. On my desk lay the final paperwork drafted overnight by legal thick as a novella. Pages clipped into color-coded sections, resolutions confirming new executive roles, access authorization for financial accounts, a revised stock ledger reflecting my stake and that of the silent investor. Each document required ink in a precise sequence, director first, then secretary, then me as incoming CEO. I skimmed every paragraph even though I had read them twice at midnight. Old habit, trust, but document. The language was bloodless, but between the lines pulsed the life of every employee waiting for this signature to settle the tremor under their feet. I uncapped my pen. It was the same blue rollerball I had used to initial vendor contracts, to jot birthday reminders for floor staff, to sign my parents' Christmas cards, familiar enough to steady my hand, yet suddenly strange, like discovering an everyday object can double as an instrument of power if held at the correct angle. My name flowed onto the first line, Noelle Carter, twice as large as I intended, as though the letters expanded to occupy the space they had long been refused. I dated it, slid the page aside, signed the next, and the next, ink gliding faster with each affirmation. By the time I pressed the final flourish beneath Chief Executive Officer, a hush settled over the room, deeper than quiet, as if even the air paused to adjust its understanding of who I had become. The final page bore a blank square reserved for the corporate seal, an embossed imprint no one had used in years because electronic filing seldom required it. I retrieved the heavy metal press from a cabinet drawer, its handles cold and faintly oily. My father used to joke the seal was our family signet ring. Now it felt more like a gavel. I positioned the page, squeezed until the paper crunched, and lifted the press. Rising ridges formed a perfect circle around our company's name and changed, since the dusty storefront days, binding yesterday's betrayal to today's authority with one irreversible dent. For a moment I simply stared at that raised emblem, light raking across its tiny valleys. It looked sturdy, permanent, incapable of caring whose hand had wielded the press. Symbols rarely show loyalty, they serve whoever claims them. The thought stung, then steadied me. I slid the sealed document to the top of the stack, exhaled slowly, and felt an unexpected peace settle behind my sternum, like a door clicking shut on a room I no longer needed to visit. The new coup Marcus brought in from our logistics partner arrived at 7 sharp. He greeted me with professional warmth, eyes sparking with the measured excitement of a man who knows he is stepping onto tectonic plates still shifting. We spent an hour mapping immediate priority, freeze discretionary spending until we audited vendor contracts, offer retention bonuses to key floor managers, contact lenders before rumors could metastasize. When we finished, he tilted his tablet away and studied me in the way seasoned executives assess structural integrity. "How are you holding up?" he asked, voice low. It felt like a trick question. People expect either steal or collapse. Nothing in between, but I answered honestly. "Tired," I said, "and upright." He nodded, as if these two states were perfectly sufficient. Before he left to brief his team, Marcus reached into his satchel and produced a small, matte black plaque bearing the company logo and my newly minted title. "Facilities were going to fabricate one," he said. "But I thought you might want something less ceremonial." The plaque weighed more than it looked, dense and cool. I thanked him, but after he left, I slid it into a drawer. I would hang it later, maybe. For now, the absence of hierarchy on my door felt like a clean, white page. By mid-morning, messages pinged across every platform, congratulations from some quarters, stunned silence from others, a handful of terse inquiries from trade journal reporters sniffing at hints of scandal. I drafted a company-wide note before any headline could miscast the narrative. The words came slowly, pared down to their strongest bones. Appreciation for past leadership, commitment to continuity, promise of transparency, assurance that payroll and benefits were secure. I read the draft aloud, my voice sounded even, but beneath it I heard a tremor, not fear of leading but of failing to guard what so many had entrusted to me. I sent the email anyway. Leadership isn't the absence of doubt, but the refusal to let it paralyze. At noon, HR notified me that my parents were clearing personal items under escort. Against the advice of counsel, I went down. The hallway outside the executive storage room smelled of cardboard and bubble wrap. Mom emerged first, carrying a showbox of framed photographs, family vacations we never took because I stayed to mind the stores. Her eyes shone, though whether from tears or fluorescent glare I couldn't tell. We stood in the hush of mechanical ventilation, and for a long heartbeat neither of us spoke. As if the English language lacked a tense flexible enough to bridge child and CEO in the same breath, I finally said I was sorry it had come to this. She looked at the box cradled in her arms, then at me, and whispered, "I never thought we'd lose you." The words sliced clean through every legal buffer. I wanted to tell her she hadn't lost me, only forfeited the version who tolerated invisibility, but grief prefers simplicity. Dad stepped out then, face drawn, a trophy he once won at a regional sales expo clutched like a relic. He met my gaze with bewildered hurt rather than anger, as if still waiting for someone to shout. April Fool, I wished I could hand them a map to where trust might be rebuilt, but cartography requires common ground. For now, all I had was a hallway too narrow for compromise. They left with cardboard and silence, escorted by security who looked apologetic beneath their badge clips. I retreated to my office, closed the door, and listened to the building breathe, elevator cables humming, phones trilling, printers clicking, a symphony of continuity indifferent to any one person's sorrow. I rested my palm on the sealed resolutions. The embossed crest cools beneath my skin, and let the ache move through me like a slow rolling tide. Pain did not eclipse the steadiness. They coexisted, weaving a new alloy inside my ribs. Near dusk, I watered the jade plant, cupping soil that smelled faintly of earth after rain. Outside the window, city lights flickered on. Steady and brave against the encroaching dark, my reflection hovered in the glass, familiar face, unfamiliar certainty superimposed over the skyline. Tomorrow we would tackle warehouses, marketing calendars, maybe even expansion again. Tonight, I sat with the simple fact that when the company needed a guardian, the contract I once wrote in hope had become a shield, and my signature had turned that shield into a compass. I switched off the desk lamp, leaving only the city's glow to graze the walls, and whispered into the dim, "It's your turn to grow now." Whether I was speaking to the plant, the company, or the untested leader in the glass, I did not specify. Some truths are big enough to cover them all. 3 weeks slipped by in a blur of policy memos, dawn-lit warehouse walkthroughs, and late-night check-ins with floor crews who still called me Miss Noelle because the formality felt safer than boss. The crisis everyone feared never materialized. Vendors kept shipping, lenders renewed lines of credit, and the holiday season, always our make-or-break quarter, began with record pre-orders. Yet the real triumph wasn't in spreadsheets turning black. It was in the subtler ways the company's pulse steadied under new stewardship. I noticed it first in the break room, the bulletin board. Once a collage of frantic post-its, now held color-coded charts showing training schedules, mental health resources, and an anonymous feedback QR code. One afternoon I lingered by the coffee maker as two cashiers argued good-naturedly about which playlist should run during closing shift. Their debate felt ordinary, but the undercurrent was trust. They assumed tomorrow's routine would resemble today's, that no sudden edict would upend their rhythm. Stability, I realized, is as tangible as any product on our shelves. Out on the sales floor, I spoke with a grandfather comparing model train kits for a birthday surprise. He had shopped with us since the one-store days and remembered the leaky roof, the tin pans catching rainwater. "You folks fixed up real nice," he said, patting my arm the way elders pass on benedictions. I thanked him, thinking how the roof and I had grown stronger together, timber-patched, heart-tempered. His compliment wasn't aimed at me personally, yet it landed in the hollow where earlier praise had never quite reached. I placed his train set in a gift bag, looped the handles just so and understood that customer loyalty is the most honest shareholder report ever printed. Still, not every cornerstone. Some staff grieved the founder's exit, confused by the silence trailing their absence. I held listening sessions in each region, explaining what I could without litigating my parents' choices. The question they never asked aloud, why did this happen, hung in every conference hall like a ghost. I told them leadership means putting the company first, even at personal cost, that mistakes have consequences. But we honor the past best by safeguarding the future. The words tasted like unsweetened medicine, but eyes across the table lifted, nodding not because pain disappeared, but because acknowledgement is its own kind of antidote. Outside those sessions, I tended to quieter repairs. I called the assistant manager whose lymphoma had since gone into remission. We adjusted her schedule so she could rebuild stamina at her own pace. I visited our long-haul drivers at a roadside diner to hear complaints about winter tires and overnight allowances. I hosted a Zoom with store custodians to ask where supply orders bottlenecked. None of these meetings made headlines or quarterly decks, but each one stitched a seam the termination letter had ripped. Power, I kept learning, is granular. It gathers in eye contact, in remembering someone's dog's name, in following up after promising you would dot at home. Life remains sparse laundry piles. Half-eaten takeout cartons, but the air felt different. I no longer stayed awake rehearsing defenses for decisions no one credited me with making. Instead, fatigue came honest, muscles sore from stockroom climbing, voice raspy from day-long conversations. Some nights I still dreamed of that Monday morning, Dad sliding the letter toward me, Mom's silence heavy as wet wool, but I always woke before impact, breathing steadily. Because the ending had already rewritten itself. One Friday close to winter solstice, Marcus and I locked the last audit file, leaned back, and allowed a rare moment of stillness. Snow whispered against the tall windows, soft and insistent. He lifted his coffee mug in salute. You know, he said, most turnarounds start with fireworks, big speeches, rebrands, new logos. You came in with a clause and a calm voice. I shrugged, unsure whether it was compliment or curiosity. Fireworks burn fast, I answered. Ink lasts longer. The line sounded rehearsed, yet its truth settled between us like a third chair, something we could both lean on. That weekend, I drove to the original storefront. Now our 12th location after a total renovation, but still carrying the bone structure of its humble beginning. The staff had organized a toy drive display by the entrance, plush animals perched atop gift-wrapped boxes, donation bins overflowing. A laminated sign read "Building Community since 2004. I stood outside, gloved hands tucked under my arms, snowflakes melting on my lashes, watching shoppers file in with winter pink cheeks. I remembered my father balancing ledgers on that very counter, my mother wiping dust off cracked windows. My younger self wrestling with doubt. The memories no longer hurt. They felt like chapters whose endings I finally understood. Inside, the store manager, a bright-eyed woman who'd started as a seasonal cashier, spotted me and waved. Got a minute? She asked, leading me to the staff room where they'd strung paper snowflakes from the ceiling. On the bulletin board hung a photocopied letter addressed to whoever keeps us going. It was from the assistant manager in remission, thanking her teammates for covering shifts, for meal train deliveries, for jokes texted during chemo. The letter ended. This place isn't just where I work, it's how I know I'm not alone. My throat tightened. Nobody referenced corporate restructuring, shareholder stakes, or leadership coups, just community built on ordinary Tuesdays, driving back through falling dusk. I realized victory wasn't the moment the board voted, or the seal embossed. It was this, the company humming through an early winter evening, customers bundled in scarves, employees laughing behind end caps, a recovering colleague choosing gratitude over resignation. It was continuity without applause, resilience without spectacle. And yet, a personal reckoning remained. I had not spoken to my parents since the hallway farewell. Their absence orbited every achievement like a dim planet visible only when I looked directly at the dark. On New Year's Eve, I drafted a letter, handwriting deliberate so the page echoed my voice. I miss us. I don't know when trust returns, but the door is open. Meanwhile, the company is safe. I didn't mention ownership stakes or bylaws, only memories, kite strings, cinnamon rolls. The night we patched the roof together, I sealed the envelope, addressed it to their home, and slipped it into a mailbox dusted with new snow. Whether they opened it was out of my hands, but some truths must be offered even without guarantee. Mid-January brought the quarterly numbers, highest seasonal revenue in 5 years. Employee turnover down 12%, customer satisfaction scores up 8. Marcus printed the report on heavy stock and laid it on my desk with 2 words underlined, "Well done." I traced the ink, feeling neither giddy nor smug instead. A quiet warmth spread through my chest, the sensation of long strained muscles. Learning relaxation, I walked to the window where the jade plant thrived, leaves glossy, new buds hinted at each tip. I turned it, so fresh growth faced the sun and whispered, "Keep goin'." The plant, unruffled, kept gathering light. That night, as I locked the office, the building's lobby lights dimmed to their after-hours glow. My footsteps echoed. A single traveler crossing an atrium once crowded with expectations that belonged to other people. At the door, I paused, hand on the push bar, and glanced back. No plaques yet adorned the wall, no port recaptured the new order. Only empty space, illuminated by quiet LEDs. Waited, I didn't need symbols tonight. The absence itself felt honest, like a page waiting for the story still unfolding. Outside, cold air stung my cheeks, sharp and exhilarating. I zipped my coat, widened my stride, and merged into the gentle tide of evening commuters. The city's pulse met mine, steady, forward, alive. They had tried to fire me like I was disposable. But I had walked away holding the power of ink, of patience, of steadfast care, and now, without fireworks or fanfare, I carried something even stronger. The knowledge that real authority is measured not by who signs paychecks but by whose lives are steadied because you refuse to crumble. Snowflakes spun beneath street lamps, each falling quiet as a held breath, and I felt their soft persistence mirror my own. Loyalty had evolved into resilience, silence into resolve, and betrayal into a story that ended not in vengeance but in stewardship. I squared my shoulders, tucked my hands into warm pockets, and stepped into the winter night, certain of only one thing: some victories resound loudest in the hush that follows, when the work continues, quietly, powerfully, ours. Before you click away, hit subscribe, ring the bell, and grab the free silent power checklist below. Protect your leverage, rewrite your story, and turn quiet resilience into unstoppable leadership.